Okay, so hello and welcome to my presentation on maximizing the podcast, building receptive and productive vocabulary skills with each episode. So, this presentation basically came about as a result of me really wanting to know the impact of using podcasts as the primary teaching tool in a listening and conversation class in an intensive English program. So the plan is basically for me to share the results of my in-class action research. Now, interestingly enough, as I was reviewing some previous studies on podcasting, I came across this interesting one from Ferengi et al., which basically came to the conclusion that it is more advantageous not to use podcasts as the primary teaching tool, but rather as a supplement to traditional textbook teaching. So, in their study, they basically had a control group which took part in your basic textbook lessons and speaking activities. And they had one experimental group which actually created student podcasts in addition to the textbook lessons and speaking activities. And then finally, a second experimental group which engaged in kind of a flipped classroom model where they listened to the podcast before class, discussed it in class, and then used the textbook as a supplement, followed by speaking skills before speaking activities before engaging in a podcast recording. So the results showed that the learners in the student-made podcast group, the first experimental group, improved more on their speaking skills compared to the other groups. And as I just mentioned, that it was also indicated that better results are achieved through incorporating podcasts within a pre-planned syllabus, including textbook lessons, as opposed to using them as a main teaching tool. So I really, the one thing about this particular study is that they actually have a textbook in each of their phases. And so there really was no comparison showing the results of strictly using a podcast as the main teaching tool. So I really wanted to check out this theory for myself. And although I haven't compared my method to a method where a textbook is used in conjunction with the podcast, I have definitely found some positive results from the all-in podcasting method that I decided to use, which we will discuss momentarily. So first, let's take a look at my research questions, or as I like to call them, points of curiosity. So my first point of curiosity was, what are the academic language learning benefits of using podcasting as the primary tool of instruction in a listening and conversation class? Well, my suppositions were that it would enable students to expand their general vocabulary, to become more comfortable listening to native English speaker conversations with greater understanding, to associate specific vocabulary with specific conversational topics, to better understand idiomatic expressions, as well as to and activate their receptive vocabulary skills by remembering certain words and expressions in context. Whew. So that definitely sounds like quite a hefty load of expectations from one teaching tool. However, as noted in Facer and Abdus, basically, podcasts are excellent sources of L2 input. And as we know from a variety of second language acquisition theories, including Gass in 1997 and, of course, Krashen in 1985, without exposure to input, students will not acquire the morphosyntactic knowledge of the L2, its phonological features, its vocabulary, or its pragmatic use. Okay, so what is my second point of curiosity here? So, how do students benefit from recording podcast episodes on specific topics every week? Okay, now I realize that this question is rather broad, and thus it really lends itself to a completely open experiment where I let the data from the students guide me. So I definitely will share some of their thoughts on this process towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so my supposition was that recording these podcasts would enhance their speaking confidence over time, increase their use of topic-related vocabulary, promote creativity in their use of the language, language, and that they would enjoy collaborating with their fellow classmates during the pair recordings. And I definitely, in this regard, we do have a few researchers whose findings indicate that some of this is definitely possible. Okay, so for example, Swain says that producing output enables learners to process language more deeply. And then Lawfer says that without pushing students to use less common lexis, it may never become part of their productive knowledge. Finally, Kemp et al. States that podcasting assignments afforded students opportunities for creativity when writing the audio script and devising techniques to capture the audience. So this one I definitely saw over time as the students changed their way of greeting the audience, as well as the closing of their episodes. Okay, so now let's take a look at my final point of curiosity, which is, does creating conversations using phrases from the podcast episodes increase retention of the vocabulary? Okay. So basically, my supposition for this was a resounding yes. And as Bueno, Alistui, and Namath state in their article on Quizlet and podcasting effects on vocabulary acquisition, students' participation in their own learning material is beneficial for their learning, as students will pay more attention to language, and processing new lexical information more elaborately will lead to higher retention. So sounds like so far so good in terms of what we're looking for. So in my method, which I'll discuss shortly, students define vocabulary in groups as well as produce written conversations using that vocabulary in context. So they are really creating and participating in their learning in two very distinct ways. So let's go ahead now and take a closer look at who our participants are before we move on to discussing the lesson method and listen to a couple of sample recordings, and then discuss how the Anchor app actually works. So the students at the LIU Brooklyn campus are part of the community at large, and they have basically migrated to the US for better opportunities. So therefore, their English studies are an essential part to them really building successful lives for themselves here. So this research takes place with intact classes totaling 13 students. The age range is 22 to 48 with a median of 35, 10 females, 3 males. 43% of them have been studying English for 0 to 2 years, and then 20% of the class had studied English for 5 to 7 years. So in terms of the level, this was the highest level at LIU, and with CEFR standards, they were B2 and C1 students. So as far as their time in the US, 50% of them have been here for 2 to 3 years, and 30% of them for over 5 years. Okay, so lastly, let's take a look at this wonderful array of 7 diverse mother tongues that were in the class. So we have Spanish, Fulani, Berber, Uzbek, Russian, Crimean Tartar, and Albanian. And then we can also see the range of countries that are represented here. Okay, so now let's take a look at the instruments that were used in this experiment. So I'll be able to provide links to some of these in the chat. Okay, so of course, first we have the podcast, which is a mixture between podcasts specifically designed for ESL learners and those that are specifically geared towards native speakers of English. Then we have the worksheets, the midterm questionnaire, the interview, the vocabulary test, and the exit questionnaire. So again, I will provide a link to each of these so that you can, well, to some of these so that you can have an idea of how I formatted the worksheets and what kinds of questions I asked for the interview. Okay, so moving on to the method. What is this method that I used? So basically, the method comes in 2 parts. Okay, so the first part is the listening. So I selected podcasts ranging in a scope of topics from the from eslpod.com down to Business English and various other authentic podcasts for native speakers, as you saw in the previous slide. Then worksheets were created, including lead-in questions, gist, vocabulary, and detailed comprehension questions. Students listen to the podcast in class 2 to 3 times, depending on the difficulty level of the material in that specific week's podcast. Then they were asked to summarize the main idea of the podcast and post it on our Padlet, okay, to share with everyone. And then the final step in this listening portion of the protocol is during the next class, the students listen to the podcast episode again with specific focus on the selected vocabulary words and phrases. Okay, so this brings us to the next phase, the production phase of this protocol. So in the next step, the students enter the meanings of the words and expressions on a Google Doc according to the context of the podcast episode. And then the terms are clarified for the whole class. In the next step, a homework task to record a podcast is basically given. So 2 to 3 minute podcast summarizing the content of the week's episode, discussing their opinion, arguing for or against the perspective of one of the characters, or discussing a personal experience with the situation in the episode. And then individual feedback was provided via email. I gave them overall comments about the episode, language correction, and of course, some kudos when they used some phrases well. Next, during the next class, the students are asked to write and perform conversations using half of the expressions from the worksheet. And then finally, at the beginning of the following class, the latest episode containing all the students' recordings is played for the students to comment on. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a listen to an example of one of these student podcast episodes. Okay, and so for this particular episode, I'm going to move this a little bit further along because I wanted us to listen to a specific student here. And this is a collaboration basically of all of the students' episodes here. So momentarily, there we go. Okay.
Hello everyone, my name is Eliona Agay. It is my pleasure to be with you on our weekly podcast. In this week's podcast, I'm going to talk about how COVID affected my life and what I'm doing to keep my family and myself healthy. Since the beginning of the pandemic, I have picked up new habits to keep my family and myself healthy. Before the pandemic hit and I was working at my old job, I found that I was really tired after work. Now that I'm not working, I have a lot more time. However, now I have a lot more work around the house, along with all of my classes. I realized that your energy throughout the day is heavily related to the food you eat. This is why I have started to eat a filling breakfast much more often. Whether it be eggs with avocado toast, cereal, or a breakfast sandwich, I try to eat something that will keep me going through my seemingly much longer day. Not only does this keep me energized, but it also much more nutritious compared to my previous routine of only drinking coffee in the morning. Additionally, I've also started making my own juice. I bought a juicer and I have started making carrot juice, apple juice, orange juice, and other combinations. Making my own juice is much healthier than drinking store-bought ones, considering how much sugar is in the store-bought ones. On top of this, playing in part with the pandemic, I have made it a habit to remind my children and the other family members to wear their masks so they do not get sick. keeping all of us healthy. I also remind my children to wash their hands often throughout the school day, as soon as they get home from school and every time they eat, to reduce the risk of getting sick. I also make sure to clean my house more often to keep us safe and healthy. This is pretty much what I'm doing to keep my family and myself healthy during the hardest time. I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast and I hope to see you next week. Bye bye.
Okay, and now let's go ahead and see how the Anchor app works. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this brief tutorial on how to use Anchor FM to record your podcast. So first you go to the App Store in order to get the free app. And I already have it here, so let's take a look. This is the front page showing my different episodes here. But let's go ahead and go to Tools because this is where all the magic happens. So when I hit Tools, we can see a variety of the different features for this app. So we have voice messages, which is where your listeners can record any responses to your content. And then we have music from Spotify, which you can use to jazz up your podcast episodes. And then we have Record, which is where all the magic happens. And here you can invite friends to join. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that so that students can collaborate by recording together from a distance, which is the whole purpose of this, yes? So when I do this, the audio will go out for a moment, but I would like to show you how it works. Okay, so as you could see there were a variety of ways that you could invite somebody to participate in your recording. And the other person doesn't necessarily have to have Anchor in order to participate. They can just click on the link and they are automatically invited to record. Now let's take a look at the library. Very important because it's where all of the audio that you record is stored. And the magic here is these three little buttons where you can trim and start and end points. You can edit your audio. You could splice it up, things like that. You can add background music, rename the segment, all of those things. So to just briefly take a look at the trim audio option, you could say, oh, let's start this here. Let's end this here. Okay, so that's just a brief look at that. And then if you don't want to use Spotify, you can use their cute little interlude music here. For your background, or you can use some sounds to transition between your segments. Okay, so now let's go ahead and just do a brief sample of a recording. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Yasmeen's Grammar Class Podcast. All right, now you want to add some background music to that, let's say. Let's go with some nice little skyway there, and we save it, and we can name it Test or whatever you'd like, test for now. You hit add this recording to episode, and I'm going to say not yet because I don't really want to publish this, but if I did want to publish it, I would hit the publish button there. I can enter the title, episode, description, season, episode number, etc. Okay, so I hope that this has given you a nice idea of how to use this app. Okay, so moving right along, taking a look at the receptive and productive vocabulary test results, we can see that the average points were about 38 over 50, okay, and that the points range from 22 to 48. So not bad, not bad. Okay, and now let's take a look at the productive vocabulary test question. Okay, so the students were asked to write about this quote using at least 8 of 16 expressions. So the quote is, you've got to get up every morning with determination if you're going to go to bed with satisfaction. And here is a lovely example of a student's response to this question. So she says, when it comes to quality of life, we have to be determined with what we want and how we want to achieve that. If we want to make headway, we have to stop wasting our potential in things that probably we don't enjoy that much or in a dead end job where we will never achieve our dreams and goals, or where our creativity will die. In this day and age, people don't know how to delegate their own time. We dedicate ourselves to being absorbed by everyday life, and stress and depression appear to make us feel even worse. I think this quote, "You've got to get up every morning with determination," resonates with me because personally, the most difficult step for me on my way to achieve what I want is to get up with determination and have an order of ideas of what I want to do and how I want to do it. So the student definitely showed a really strong ability to use the underlined expressions there. Okay. All right. So now let's move on to some of the responses. Okay. So this is a response to the open ended question of, how do you think you have benefited from recording podcast episodes? So some of the students said, "I improved writing and speaking. Now I can listen to myself as I talk and see the mistakes I make. I feel my pronunciation has improved a lot. I know how to record it. Maybe one day I will have my own podcast." This is one of my favorite responses. And of course, new vocabulary. All right. So some final thoughts on the vocabulary improvement. They were asked on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, how much do you feel you have improved your vocabulary skills through listening to podcasts? Now, I have a big, bright, cheerful 10 here, but unfortunately, there were no tens reported. We have a tie between 7 and 8. Okay, and then we have some nines. So hopefully, through my tweaking of this process, we will get to a 10 in terms of their feeling for vocabulary improvement. Okay, so before we open it up for discussion and any questions that anyone might have, I assigned the students a final project in pairs where they had to create their very own podcast, including choosing the name, the artwork, the subject, writing the description for both the overall show and the episode. And here is a sample of one that I really enjoyed.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode on Yana's talk show. Today is the day. We are having a special guest, my childhood friend Zeleny. Our talking points today will be about careers. Welcome, Zeleny. What did bring us today?
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here and to collaborate with my lovely friend Yana on this podcast. Today, I'm going to answer some questions about the age when kids and teenagers start talking about their preferences in terms of careers.
Okay, Delaney, so my first question. As a child, what field did you want to be in? What career was more mesmerizing for you at the age, let's say of 5-7?
Well, to begin with, let's remember those days when we were kids. Remember, Jana? You dreamed of being a flight attendant.
Yep, and I'm still dreaming of that.
Oh, wow! It's great to hear that. Personally, I dreamed of being an actress or a famous talk show host. And as you can see, I ended up being an actress.
Yeah, and I really enjoy watching movies in which you perform. What age is good to start thinking upfront about your professional career?
That's an interesting question. Well, in this day and age, kids are different. They have access to the internet. They can read about any career and find any information that they need. But what about us? 20 years ago, we were in the dark about a lot of stuff, including careers.
Yeah, you are right. 95% of American teens have access to a smartphone now. But in your opinion, what are some important aspects to look at when choosing a career?
Well, in my point of view, it's related to what your interests, skills, talents, and strengths are. It's also linked to your personality and values.
Okay, let's pretend that I want to be a print journalist, but the wages are too low and they won't be enough to feed the family, pay rent, and all that stuff. What should I do in this situation? Is this a dead end job?
Um, Nowadays, people can access to the internet more quickly and with greater ease than getting the paper. But you have to understand that it's really important to have job security. I'm more than sure that 99.9% of people want to have a good quality of life, or even more, being one of the privileged few.
Yeah, I'm totally agree with you. What great answers you gave us today. Thank you, Delaney. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I hope your answers will help a lot of people who are in the middle of choosing a career.
Thank you, Jana. It was a great pleasure for me to speak about it. Please, you and the audience, check the trailer on my new action movie, The Girl That Caught the Sky. See you next time.
See you, peers. As always, I say, be kind.
Okay. All right. So, yes, I have some ideas for future research. Okay. But I think we're a little bit out of time. Okay. And all right. I'm just going to. You have just attended Maximizing the Podcast. Thank you so much for your attention today. Okay. We'll open it up for questions.